Hey guys, this is Eric Weingart with Weingart Racing. Before I start this video, I want to say a few things because I just already know it's going to be a thing. There's probably stuff I'm going to say that's wrong in this video because I usually do one takes. So if there's a mistake, there's a mistake. I ain't got time to redo this. The other thing is, I am not a god guru at this. Yes, I port heads all the time. And yes, I think I'm pretty good at it, but I don't like to brag for one. So don't take this as absolute gospel. It's just what I've learned over the years. The next thing, since I know some of you are watching this and you're like, what the hell is this video even about? Well, here's what happened. On Saturday, I put up my update videos and I said, man, I'm gonna run out of ideas. You guys want to see something that can put ideas and I'll try to teach you about it today. And that's what today is about. So I took a lot of what they asked for and I put it in this video. So in case you're wondering what's there. But since I know several of you watched the Saturday's video, I'm going to tell you the 540, a little bit of update just before we begin. It was all together. It didn't have any piston valve clearance. So now it's got to come all the way back down to get fly cut the pistons for piston valve. It had 0. Probably because the Pro Max heads that were on it had been milled 54,000 to get them down to 110 cc's. With the canvas solid roller that's got some strength to it, there ain't no room. So that's kind of sucks, but anyway, so I didn't want to tell you guys about that. But let's get to the video. Like I said, just be patient. You'll learn a lot, I hope. I have thought about, by the way, guys, I know several of you mentioned this. What about doing a class? I've thought about it, but if I did, it'd be something like charging $1,000 for 2 days, and I'd probably only have 6 people. And it'd just be not for like, I'm going to make you an advanced porter, just someone trying to learn the basics. We'll do some grinding and stuff. If you're interested, put that in the comments. I'm just kind of curious, gauging whether there'd be any interest in all anyway. But anyway, let's get to this one. So I have kind of an outline of what I'm going to talk about. So one of the things that people asked about in the comments was, can you explain about the size, the average CCs or average cross-sectional area that a head should have for what I'm wanting to do? And I don't really use those averages too much, and I'm going to tell you why. So here's what we have. I just did 2 simple drawings. If an average, the thing you have to remember, I'm back up a little bit. Your area of the head is directly related to velocity. If the head is bigger, the velocity is slower. If it's smaller, the velocity is faster. The problem with averages is this. So I'm doing a generic drawing here. These two could theoretically have the same volume, so in the same length. So the way we get our average cross-sectional area is we take a port and we fill it up with fluid, we CC the whole thing, and we divide it by its length. And that will give us our average cross-sectional area. So math there involved. I'm not going to do the whole formula, but you get the idea. That gets generic of it. Well, the problem is the average can have this looking the same as that. So then you get a head that looks like this versus one that might be straight, such as this. And the averages, as far as cross-sectional areas, look exactly the same, but the heads respond totally different. This would be the better example. This is your basic layout, say for a small block Chevy, some small block Fords. You've got a little bit of trough here. It comes up and over because we're at a 23-degree valve angle versus something like an LS3 where we've got more of a raised run and it's down like this. Both of them can, in theory, we could make both of them the same CCs. For instance, these are 240 CCs. I have small block Chevys that are this design. They're also 240 cc's. Average-wise, length and everything, they look like they'd be the same, which, by the way, these are theoretically longer. But regardless, you can have them look the same. There's no way this one will make as much power as this one. Do you get what I'm saying? So I don't use average cross-sectional areas or average velocities, for that matter, when dealing with it so much. Like, that's not a big factor to me because of this. Because averages, you could ignore a lot of stuff. Like, you could say, well, I've got this, size, but you're totally missing like a huge spot or a huge spot where it gets slow, fast, slow, or consistent speed. Which would you rather have? A consistent speed. That's a problem with average velocity and average cross-sectional areas. It ignores those factors. That's why I don't really use it. So some people ask that, would you talk about what you need for that? I don't really use those in a way, which I'll talk about more in a minute, but those to me are almost garbage because of the design of the head. So in fact, first thing I want to talk about is CCs are garbage. So most cylinder head companies, they all have their heads and they're based on CCs. For instance, this is a Pro Max Cathedral Port LS head. It's a 245 CCs. This is the Pro Max LS3 small bore head. It's 240 CCs. If you were just looking at the volume size and you said 245, 240, this one should be larger because it's 5 cc's difference. But what that doesn't take into account with cc's is the length of the runner. Because going back to, I'm going to draw a bad picture here, but you see this here, let's do that. But what if your runner was, say, way longer? And we'll pretend that this one, which is not a great drawing, this had the same volume as this. Which one's actually smaller? The cc's won't tell you that because the cc's, they look exactly the same. But the length of the runner adds more volume. So it makes it look like it's as big as a gigantic one. I've had this happen several times on big blocks, especially when you're doing with the SR20 versus the standard port one, standard port big block head. You could say 450 cc's, but if it's a raised runner, it's an inch longer, which taking up more volume. So you cannot use cc's for it, especially, and there's another thing, when you compare different engine families. For instance, this is a small block Ford. Its runner is about a tenth or so smaller than a small block Chevy. So I think even smaller than that, some of them. So what you could do is you could have a small block Chevy at 220 cc's. You have a small block Ford at 220 cc's. The size inside the small block Ford is bigger. So the average area, so the area is inside, not even average. If you were mapping it out and drawing out the whole port on a piece of paper, the Ford would look bigger than the Chevy, even though their cc's exactly the same. Same thing goes with these. When you raise up a runner, it's much better anyway, but typically that whole runner is getting up, so the whole port grows and its length grows. So the 240 cc's here only sounds like it's 5 cc smaller than this, but it's raised up. So if you do the measurements on the inside, the area is actually smaller on this one, even though it's 5 cc's. No, it's dramatically smaller than in here. And the other thing is, if you look at this cathedral one, you've got a lot of area here, less area, instead of more consistent as it goes through this one. That's why you can't, cc's are garbage. What I like to use is to figure out heads, and might help many of you, is minimum cross-sectional area, which several people have talked about it, and it's a very important thing, but it's not the most important thing. So you might say, well, where do you find out what minimum cross-section you need? Well, let me show you this. What you see here, comes from Stan Weiss's website. I think it's like Ursol on there. I don't even know if it shows up right, but this is the one I use the most. This one is the one I use to calculate how much minimum cross-sectional area I actually need to have for the cylinder head. So you type in the bore stroke and the RPM you want it to be, and then the velocity part, you're like, man, that looks really high. That's actual engine running velocity. So actually, I changed that a little bit. I'm not going to tell you what number I put in there. And that will tell me the minimum cross-sectional area I actually need to have. Now, sometimes I'll change the velocities for like a street deal versus a strip deal, but that will tell me the minimum CSA I actually need to have. Then I use these other programs. So I'm about to show you 3 others that I also use. Okay, this is one of the programs that I use for porting as well. So you asked where some of the math came from. I used to know all the formulas, I just don't. I use these programs because they're much easier. So I don't know all the formulas now at all. They're all here. So what this program is, this one is an old version. So if you look at the top, this is PIP Max Pro version 3.7. And the way it works is you enter in the inputs up here, like your bore, your stroke, what you think is the volumetric efficiency for your engine. And when you press calculate, it will tell you this is approximately how much airflow you need on the intake side and how many CFM you need for the intake. And this is about what you need on the exhaust. And this is what they think it's going to make. So I actually entered, the numbers are from the dyno meal, the 406. So if you look at it, it's supposed to make average 637. The best it's ever made, 633. So we're below average. But if you look at it, when you enter in you enter your cam specs in too, it will tell you a whole bunch of stuff that's super, super important, and it tells you velocity. So let me scroll down to kind of show you. So one of the things here I'm trying to look at the same time is, bear with me as I'm doing this with you at the same time. It's hard to see. I use this. This is helpful for a head porter. So I'm trying to get a chamber size. I will use this because this tells me how much I could take off the margin of the valve and how many cc's that will be. So like for the intake side, if I cut off 17 thousandths, I will have dropped 1 cc. Will I do that? Probably not. But it is helpful, especially when you're trying to target. And same thing with the exhaust over here. But then if you keep scrolling down, it tells you your average piston speed, And then it tells you, of course, your cam specs, it just relists them again. But then it tells you this. This is the recommended valve lift you should have. So the minimum you have to have was 679. I'm at 685. And it says the normal one you need to have is 731, max 805. But if you keep scrolling, if you look here, it says minimum intake valve to prevent choke at 7,000 RPM is 731 lift. I have 685. So you see why I said the camshaft's limiting it? This one is where that program, it kind of gives you a guidance on that. Then the next thing it shows you is the harmonic. So this tells you the links you should have for your total intake link system for your head and head and intake manifold together. Tells you which harmonics you're going to be in for the RPM range to get it right. This tells you which area should be at the entry, and so on and so forth. If you keep scrolling down, I'm going to keep skipping a lot of stuff. This is probably where you wanted to see. This tells me your average air speeds. Now these are measured through a pitot tube, not the actual running of an engine. But it tells me your recommended one that I have should have an average for says should be 2.711 and 2.607. This is not the minimum. This is the average that it's asking for, which should be the whole port divided by, or CCs divided by the length, and that will tell you your average cross-sectional area. And then from that, you can get your velocities from that. And this is what it should be. So that's one of them. But this is a really old version. This is, you could purchase this right now. So you can go to, hopefully Larry doesn't mind me showing this, but this is from PIP Max. This is an old version, 3.7. His new one, I'm getting ready to show you. My hand's starting to get weak from holding my camera up, but it's from PIP Max. Larry Moe is the one that sells it. I think it's like, I don't know how much it is now, but it was 50 bucks. This is an old version. And the new one, I'm just not much of a fan of, but I'll show you that it looks like this. So this is the new version. It has way more inputs. As you could tell here, they put everything in as well. So this is the new version of it. It's like 4.3, and the other one I showed you 3.7. I'm just not a fan of this one, and it probably has way more stuff that makes it far more helpful, but I just not as much of a fan. You can do horsepower calculations from that. This is some other stuff that goes with ET stuff. But if I click here, this one does something a little bit more sophisticated. It tells you the same things as before, like your intake flow you should have, your valve lift that you should have. But this one actually tells me what camshaft lifts or durations I should have, like 268 on intake, 275 if I really want to get radical. But this one only estimates it to make 586 entering the same inputs, which is kind of weird, which makes me think that I put something in different. By the way, the fuel per hour is 282, and on the dyno, we've never used that much fuel. So would you be like, well, then you're not making as much power? Maybe. I don't know. But if it took 282 pounds to make 586 horsepower, it's weird to me, anyway. So, but it just does a bunch of stuff, and that's where some of the numbers from. The camshaft stuff's pretty helpful too. This one is, I think, the latest version that he sells, and Larry Moe's a great guy. If you're watching this, Larry, if you want to go over some of this with me, I'll be happy to go over with you, but I haven't used this new one hardly at all. The third program I use, and by the way, these are both reasonable. So this PIP Max is pretty reasonable, at least the last time I bought it. I still use the old version way more just because it's easy for me. Let me go back. I use this version 3.7 more than I ever do the new one, just because it's so easy to get this stuff that I need, and then also the other stuff that's on there. Maybe it's because I'm just used to it. The last program I use is this one. I think scroll down here. Looks like this. This is a very expensive program, like ungodly expensive, it feels like. This is Engine Analyzer Pro, says here at the top. This one will estimate horsepower as well. It does way more stuff. You have to put in about a bazillion inputs. I mean, bazillion. This program's something like $700. At least I think it's like $560 when I bought it. And that's been almost 10 years ago, so I'm assuming it's like $700. Very expensive. If you don't do this for a living, you wouldn't get anything out of it. It's really good at estimating the horsepower. As you could tell, it guessed 638 horsepower, 639. We made 633, so missed it by 6. The torque's way off, though. 566, we've only made like 540. But it does a bunch of other stuff. If you scroll down on here, it'll tell you pumping percents, a bunch of other stuff. Do I have the right mouse? Probably not, no. There we go. If I scroll down, of course it says you can't change that. Something's dumb. But anyway, there's a whole bunch of stuff here, but if I keep looking here, these are all the specs. This is neat. This tells me what I should pump. So if I was putting a cranking compression ratio tester on my engine, it should pump 183. It even estimates what my vacuum would be at 9.3. So I use this sometimes for camshaft to make sure it's pulling enough vacuum for a customer. So because I do spec camshafts, no, I don't use this spec camshafts. There's other stuff I use, which is much harder to get into. This will kind of get you there. Like if you're totally in the dark on which one to go, you could use this program and it'll probably get you something close, but not really. I mean, it'll get you close. I should say it'll get better than a lot of the internet cam gurus, but it's not 100%. I could promise you that. There's been several times where like it says something and I've done something different that worked way better, or something like this where it just hadn't been as great. But anyway, at least it does that. That's super helpful. So how much curriculum does the engine have? Probably 183. And this has been accurate. I've checked before. Vacuum at 9.3. But anyway, yeah, this one's super helpful. We're like, how does it get all this stuff? Go into my mouse here. I'm going to go back. Do I want to save these results? And I'll say no. But you have to enter like the short block specs, the cylinder head specs. And by the way, there's flow tables that go with it. There's a lot of stuff you have to actually enter. And so, I mean, a ton. So, like, this is the intake one, like the links, the runner entry area, the taper, there's a bunch to it. So, this is one of the programs I use. You can also change fuels on it. But that's two of the programs, or three of the programs that it's used for the porting to figure out some of it. This really is not so much used for that, besides to say whenever I look at it, let me just get rid of this. I actually use this more for when I'm trying to see what the potential of the actual head has to be. So how much, even if I got it as good as it could, how much actual power would it theoretically make? As far as getting you the areas for porting, not really. PIP Max, that first one I showed just for that. Since I'm on my old computer, I don't even have this thing hooked up to the internet at all anymore. It's like Windows 7. I'm going to show you some pictures. You'll get a kick out of this. Start off here. This is where Weingarten Racing actually started. This is my old home. I don't live here anymore. That's my old C10 pickup. I got rid of that. You know, I painted that whole thing black and put a Punisher right here. Weingarten Racing was right there. That's where it started. That little third car garage right there. That's where a lot of it did. And this is I made this for Halloween, my little headless horseman. That was a pretty cool thing. Some little prick kept cutting my lights though. I lived in that neighborhood. But yeah, that's where Weingarten Racing started. No longer there. Let me show you some other stuff. I hate there we go. This is the first flow bench I ever made. Well, not the first one. This is like the last iteration of a homemade one before I went to a Signs. This looks confusing as hell because it should be. Inside of here, there's two sections. There's a top plenum and then there's a bottom plenum. And inside here, look at these switches. There are 11 motors and they're all 120 volt motors. So I was using most of the power of the entire house to fire it because inside is that 3-car garage. The way it works, this is just a vacuum box, which hooked up to this plastic tube. They went through and then had an orifice, and then the black box read the pressure difference between the two, and then you hooked up the head further upstream. But anyway, the way it worked was I would kick on all three at once, and these valves here were check valves, so I'd have them open, and I'd close them. I'd leave them open when I turn it on, and I'd close them to get it right to 28 inches. And then if it wasn't pulling enough vacuum, what I would do is I'd crack them open again, turn on another motor, and then I'd close them. So it's bleeding off the amount of vacuum that it was actually pulling. It worked phenomenal. Loved it. Used up a whole lot of air, but it had a lot of, great capacity. I never did it. I will say this. I imploded this. This was like the third iteration of that box I made, because the first two I actually imploded where it had pulled so much vacuum that it collapsed. So I had to do a whole deal on the inside to build like a whole skeleton in there. The thing weighed a ton. That's pretty cool. And then last thing I want to show you. Let's keep going on. These are the 10XRI heads that are on Cecil's motor. This is like the first time I got done. Look how big. Those look big, but they're not big. They're wide, not big. Because if you look at this picture, right there. These are the same head. This was done ported by Self Racing for the 2009 Engine Masters, because there was supposed to be a guy that was going to do a CNC program for me and never did. Didn't get it done in time. So I had to have Self do it, otherwise I'd miss the competition. He made the ports gigantic. Those were like 270 cc's. So it still made fairly decent torque, but those ports were huge. And last thing, these are the heads from 2008. These are some Dark Pro ones that I ported. You can see a little epoxy in there. Those did really well, so not bad. But anyway, there's that. Let me go on to other stuff.
So after all that, you might be asking yourself the third thing. Well, how do I pick a head then, man? I'm watching these YouTube videos. I'm trying to learn as much as I can. You really are better off, and it sounds like I'm an arrogant prick when I say this, to call an actual cylinder head company, someone like myself that sells cylinder heads or others, and ask them to buy the head from them. And I know it sounds like I'm trying to sell something, which kind of, I guess I am. I don't take anything away from that. Because there's no way like let's say you wanted to get heads to get ready for the spring. There's no way in 3 months you're going to learn enough to pick a actual correct head. You're going to learn a lot of information from somebody you're already like, yes, I can. I'm not stupid, which I'm not saying anybody is. But there's so many intricacies to learn to pick the right head. So, for instance, if you just use the last formula, you've got your minimum CSA. Unfortunately, most cylinder head manufacturers don't put it out. I've recorded it since I port so many heads. I know what the minimum CSA usually is from the beginning. I definitely know what my imported heads are, so I know what those are going to be. Not all companies put that information out. Even if you had that, you're still missing, you only have one piece of the puzzle. And that one piece, if you're like, I'm totally focused on that, you're missing the bunch. Because let me tell you this, the fourth thing, minimum CSA isn't everything. And so I know already some people are about tapping away. Let me explain. In my experience, the minimum CSA becomes far more crucial the more RPM you turn. So for instance, several of you are just trying to get ahead for your street strip 383 or 408 maybe, or your 6 liter for your LS or whatever, right? You're not really doing that much race stuff. You might limit yourself to 6,500 RPM. I'm saying this. The CSA for those is less important than it is for something turning 8,500 RPM. So in my experience, a lower RPM stuff, you can get away with a really small CSA. You can even get away with a slightly large CSA because it's not, you're like, no, you just lost torque. There are several examples, if you watch enough of my channel where I've done dyno stuff, where the larger CSA made more torque down low than it did at the top and more power at the top. So it's not entirely true. See what I mean? When there's more to it. In my experience, usually on the dyno stuff, the CSA if you make it small, the lower RPM stuff, it does bring up torque, but not as much as you're thinking. You would think, well, if I make it super small and make a ton of torque down low, the thing is, you can have a much larger CSA than which actually required, and you only lost maybe 5 foot-pounds of torque down low, only 5, and you gained a lot of power. It doesn't seem that way, but that's how it is. That's why I say when you get to the higher RPMs, it seems like those differences from the CSA, from what you need, from what you actually have, become much greater than at the lower RPM. And I'm really talking about pretty much from 6,000 RPM down. So if in doubt, though, if you're a street guy, target the lower CSA. Some people will regret, but it's easier to be smaller on the CSA side and be less of an issue. At least you make it torque at certain areas. If you go too large, it doesn't necessarily make you a dog down low. And you're like, and I know some people are tapping right away. Remember, a stock LS3 head is gigantic. Its CSA is like 3.2, okay? Huge. Remember, a 6 liter is like essentially 360 something cubic inches. Way more cross section than it needs. Way more. Still makes great torque. So when people say that stuff, understand there are exceptions. That the different things you can do. They make it up with camshaft. So they're using, which I'll get to in a minute, but essentially what they do is, since the cross section is so big, way more than what they need, reduce duration. And I can build up torque that way. So there's more than one way to skin a cat, several different ways. The point I'm trying to make is, if you're doing a street deal, you could target the smaller size, but don't be afraid to go large. Because, and I don't mean like go insane. Don't put a 245 cc head, small block Chevy, that cross-sectional area, which would be like 2.7, on a 350 that's only going to turn 6,000. You created a dog. However, if you've got something that's 2.5 but really needs 2.2, you don't have a dog. It might be 5 foot-pounds of torque down lower. It will charge higher in the RPM. But what you can do is you can reduce the duration on the camshaft, and then you've got back that torque at the lower RPM, and guess what? You've got more horsepower at the upper RPM. So CSA isn't everything, but it's definitely more important the higher RPM you become. So you turn an 8,000 RPMs, if you miss it by 0.2, it's huge. It's more than 5 foot-pounds of torque, at the lower RPM. You miss it on the higher RPM, you're down like 30 horsepower, and it feels like you're hitting a brick wall. So it's much more important. You notice I haven't really talked so much about CFM because of this. An engine itself does have a certain amount of CFM that's required. And here's the thing that gets people stuck too. 3 things relate in cylinder heads. They go together. Size, CFM, and velocity. Those 3 are like married. It's a weird marriage of the 3 because the size dictates also the CFM that it will flow in general. And also that size will dictate the velocity. The CFM can also change the velocity. Do you get what I'm saying? They go together. So if you just ignore CFM, you just focus on the size so you can get your velocity up, but it doesn't flow any air, you're still ain't gonna make any power. A prime example is you could look at the double hump head for a small block Chevy. Those things have really small size, the velocity is really high, they don't flow any air, they don't make as much power as something that's larger. Get what I'm saying? So CFM is super important. So you might be asking yourself, well then, how do I know what CFM to pick? Or how much CFM my engine should have? Let me show you. This slide you see here is from when Darren Morgan and Preston Mosier of BES Racing were presenting at PRI. This is what I use to determine the actual CFM that's needed of an engine. Now, this is only one. PIP Max, which I already showed you, will also tell you about how much CFM you need. But this one's very, very good. It's just real easy to use and figure it out on your calculator. And this will tell you your CFM needed. So, yeah, this came from BES Engines, 2 head porters that they have there, Darren Morgan and Preston Mosier. So that brings up the next thing, which was how do I port heads? And we'll start with valve size. So here we have the LS small port head from Pro Max, which Jason, please call me up. I'm trying to get another one to use for the dyno mule. Anyway, the first thing you have to do, I think about, is valve size, because I get asked that. To me, I work with 2 valve heads. I don't work with 4 valve heads. People have asked me, I don't do that. That ain't my bag. That's a different world, and I'm not in it. I look for, in a 2 valve head, I try to shove the biggest intake valve in the head I can put in it. You're like, oh, you're already messing it up. Engine Masters Challenge, when I competed in that, taught me that for sure. Because one of the first guys that I saw was like, which I thought the same as maybe some of you, like, no, that smaller valve has more velocity and you're going to make more power. Yes, but having a larger valve allows you to do something else. Because I saw Tony Bischoff, he had a 219 valve in a small block Chevy. And I was like, wow, that's crazy. And a 23 degree head nonetheless. So I was like, wonder why? Well, it takes some theory to figure this out. But when you go to the larger valve, the one thing you don't want to do is you don't want to have it shrouded off too much. Like this is shrouded. Look how close that is. But guess what? It works. The reason why like stock LS3 heads have such a bigger valve too, like if you notice an LS3 has a 2.165 intake valve from the factory in their LS3 on a 360 something cubic inch engine. It sounds way too large. Why does it work? Because when you have a larger valve, you have more curtain area. And you're like, so what that allows you is, since you have more curtain area, you can reduce your duration. So if you reduce the duration of the camshaft, you now build more torque. So the reason why it works so great in the Engine Masters is because you have a bigger valve. Soon we make it move super fast, we expose the curtain area, but we don't have to keep it open longer so we can build more torque. There's a benefit to having a larger valve. The other one, for racing applications, obviously, the bigger the valve, in theory, we should move more air. So that's one of the great things. Now, there are some disadvantages. You obviously don't want to be too far into it because cylinder bore is going to limit you no matter what. But I've never seen a case where a larger valve with porting has made the head flow less or make less power. Now, obviously, some people are ready to be like, nope, I put a 202 valve in a Vortec head that made less power and it flowed worse. That's because you didn't do any port work to go with it. You do have to unshroud around the chamber a little bit, but it does make more power that way. So first thing I do is I look for the biggest valve I can shove in there, and that's what I try to putting into it. But there's always exceptions. It's never 100%. So for instance, some circle track stuff, I would love to put a huge valve into some of them, but I don't because they're limited. Some of them are on stainless steel valves, and they're going to turn 8,500 RPM. Well, and some of them limit to the stem size too. So it's at that point, you're like, you got to think about weight. The weight of the valve is going to weigh more with a bigger head, so then they lose valve train control. So in some of those situations, even though it may not be the best, the durability is better having a smaller valve so that it can live longer. The engine, as far as valve flow goes. So it's anything I said here is always, every time you need to do this. There's always exceptions. So anyway, that goes to some of the reason for the bigger valve. Let me see if I missed anything else. Oh, which brings up something else. Some people have asked about the camshaft duration versus a small block Chevy versus LS. You know, I've even thought that as well. For those that don't know, I have a small block Chevy 406 dyno mule, but currently being built as we speak is a 408 LS dyno mule. And hopefully I'll get to put the other head, if Jason would send me another one, this head on here, which is the small bore 208 intake valve, 1600 exhaust valve on that engine. And I have having the engine built with the exact same camshaft profile that's in the small block Chevy, which is 260 degrees of duration on intake and 270 on exhaust, 108 lobe separation, 685 lifted. Yeah, it's a solid roller because I'm a man. I am curious, and I hate to say this because I feel like I'm throwing up in my mouth as I'm saying this. I have a feeling, a very strong feeling, and I hate to say it, I think the LS is actually going to outdo it. It's going to outdo the small block Chevy. And I've been saying for a while, you do the same things on the small block Chevy and the LS will make about the same power. I don't think it's going to happen that way, and I'm going to explain this. This head flows so much more air, but that's the part of it. A small block Chevy doesn't flow this much. So even with my ported ones, they're going to go 330. This one already going 350. It's 20 CFM more. So when I add that extra duration that's got more time to move in more air, it's going to make more power. So one of the things. But several people have asked, why do then LSs have less duration than a small block Chevys? Like, why is that? The largest thing I think is twofold, which I've already kind of mentioned. One, the valve size. Most LS heads have a much larger valve size than a small block Chevy. Now, granted, this is a 208, but most LS3s have a 2.165 valve, and I already told you, bigger curtain area, you reduce the seat, you can reduce your cam duration and make more torque. The other thing really has to do with head flow. You've got to get a certain amount of CFM into the engine to make power. So having the more head flow, you'll get that CFM that the engine actually needs in less time than you would with, say, a small block Chevy where it's not flowing as much, so I got to keep the valve open. Which brings up the next thing. I don't know why the camera just did that. If you're ever wondering, how do some small engines or small cross-sectional areas that are choked out, how do they get them to turn more RPM like super stock stuff? They add duration. So if you can't add airflow, obviously there's a certain point where you just can't add any more airflow, you can't add any more area because of rules. The only thing you do is leave the valve open longer, so it pulls more to get more in there. There's disadvantages, obviously. It's going to kill some torque at the lower RPMs because your duration's so far spread. You know, you're going to kill some of that low-end torque, but it allows you to make more high RPM horsepower because you're leaving the valve open longer. So hopefully that kind of explains the differences, in my opinion, of the LS versus the small block Chevy. Now, right now it's opinions. Once the dyno mule's done, we'll have an answer. We'll see if it actually peaks at the same point, which I don't think it will. I'm betting that LS with that camshaft is going to peak about 7,300 RPM, where right now the small block's peaking at 68. Okay, going on. So, first thing is valve size. Next one's throat. We're going to go to this drawing. Throat percentage is you take the valve size you have and you times it times what percent you want. 90% typically, they say, generally a good one to go with. I go bigger because of the valve job. So if you have a steep valve job like this, if you go 91%, you're going to make some super sharp edges. But when I have a steeper valve job, say 50 degree instead of a 45, I can make that throat bigger because it will still have that radius it needs for the air to make the turn instead of a sharp edge that would have it on a 45 degree valve job. So I make my throats bigger. Here's a small video of me doing the throat so you can kind of get an idea. Okay, so several of you asked how I do throats. I thought I'd show you kinda. So I've got the camera set up on a tripod. I don't know how this is gonna mess me up. I'm probably gonna bump this thing like 50 times. But essentially what I do is, this is a set of AFR heads I'm porting, so you could kind of tell. The first things I do is when I'm porting is I do the bowls. So I do that. But if you notice, because this head is dirty, you could see, which I don't know how well this camera's going to capture it because I'm going to lay it back in space. There we go. You can see where I leave this distance right here where I haven't touched, because that's where I'm going to set my throats from here. And I kind of try to do it all the way around this way so that I have my bowl here, because the bowl essentially from
the guide perpendicular. So right here, that's how I measure my bowl width. But I usually come up to about, leave a little step here, and that's how I'm gonna have my throat, because I use this material so I can make the transition round. Now, I offset my throats, which I don't think that's any too much of a secret. I'm not gonna give too much away, but essentially, I will remove, this is a small block Chevy head, but I will have more of a radius on this side than I do on this side, because the air's gotta turn here. It's coming flat off here, so it's got less to do. So in other words, I'll remove more material here from this side to make the throat than I will this side. So that's how I do it. Now you might say, what about top and bottom? Well, from this side, I don't touch this part of the throat on the short side till I'm actually working the short side. This bottom part, so from pretty much from here to here, I'm working with what I'm doing right here when I'm in this position. I won't touch the actual short side throat area until I'm doing the short side, which is way down the line as far as porting goes. So what I've done first is I measure, I have these, and I set them up to do my thing. So for instance, this one's got a little shade there. This one's already done. And then you might say, well, that looks like crap. Remember, it's just like a haircut. When you first start cutting your hair's gonna look pretty crazy. The same thing goes with porting. So at the beginning, it's not supposed to look perfect. In the end, it does. But anyway, as you can tell, these ones already been cut. And you kind of get what you order. But then you're like, well, how do you actually cut it, though? Because there's a lot of YouTube videos and no one actually says how to do it. Well, it's gonna suck because a lot of you aren't using the same stuff I'm using. So what I have is a Fordham setup, and this is my Fordham grinder, and this is a horrible view. This is a hand piece, and I've got a 6-inch long shank here, and I'm using a 1/2 inch 3/8 or 1/2 inch, sorry, aluminum cut burr that you can get from Cylinder Head Abrasives. You can get this. I get mine from Cylinder Head Supply. And on my Fordham, I can adjust the speed, and I've got a foot pedal, which currently it's broken or not really working a little bit. I have it set at a much lower speed than I'm going to do the bowls. And the bowls, I'll go wide open throttle and just start hogging. But on my throat, I really don't. I don't trust myself because I'm going to try to do this without bumping this. But essentially, I'm going to go here and I'm rolling it out. And right now the tripod's in my way, so I can't get it perfectly. So we'll try this so you can kind of see. I'm holding it essentially like this and rolling it in. Going around again. So I go like this to here. That's how I'm doing them. So if you notice, I'm never like flat against it. I'm always at an angle because again, I'm trying to get angle here. So when I'm, which is horrible, sorry about the view because I don't know how else to do this without having this on my forehead. But essentially, I'm here and rolling it in. But I actually start, I'm going to try cutting and just see what happens here. So bear with me, although this thing's probably going to get in my way and I'm going to get pissed. But yeah, it's going to mess up. That's essentially what, I'm not even close to being cut because I can feel it squared. It needs to be rounded. And I'm starting again with this side instead of this side because this one's where I'm really taking more material. This one I'm rounding it. So I'm not really trying to remove so much from this side of the throat like I will from this one. Now, several of you are like, well, can't you just make it perfectly round instead of having an offset? Yeah, there are some cases where I'll make it perfectly offset. So in that case, I'm doing the same thing here. I'm just doing the same thing over here. So it literally goes like that. So I still start here and come back over here, but I'm doing it this side. The way I'm doing it this side is the same way I'm doing it here. Because when I'm cutting the throat over here, I'm more flat against it. I'm barely rolling out compared to being way over with my porting, which I know this is a horrible view. Instead of being way over here when I'm doing it. See, I'm at an angle with the burr, so it creates an angle when it's cutting. As opposed to this side, I'm more straight and slightly leaning. Because I still want it to radius out. I don't want straight cuts. That sucks. That actually reduces airflow. It's not great. And you're like, well, you got to have the sharp edge for that. That's what the angle is on your seat, and that's why I don't radius it out. And some of you are like, why don't you use radius seats? Because you need the angle to break up fuel. So essentially that's what I'm doing, which I know isn't great. Unless I can attach this camera to my forehead, you really can't see it done correctly. But you kind of got an idea on that side. That's how I do it. Anyway, there you go.
The last thing I'll talk about really is the bowl. The bowl for the heads, people have asked, well, what size should make the bowl? You never really talk about that because it's so independent on the cylinder head itself and the use for it. So for instance, if I have a port that's like this, I have to make the bowl bigger, which is this area through here, because I have to get it to slow down the air that's coming over here so it can make this turn. Otherwise, it just ramps it and it flows less. Remember, you've got to have a certain amount of CFM regardless. It's got to be there. So making the bowl bigger, which creates kind of like this situation, has to happen just for the air to turn down. So it's kind of like you're going to have to, it's compromise. Something has got to give. You're going to have to make somewhat of this in the bowl area for these ports that are low port like this so that the air can make the turn. It's definitely not ideal. So in a situation like this one, where we have a nice raised up runner, nicer deal, you wouldn't need as much bowl. You don't need the bowl to be that big. So to give it an exact percent that you should have and you should follow, you just can't do it. It's too dependent. The other thing is, even if you have a port like this, if it's a circle track deal, I usually make the ports much smaller, even road course, or the bowls smaller, because yes, it might ramp the short side and it backs up on the flow bench, which everybody's like, oh my goodness. But you know what that does do? It actually makes more torque at the lower RPM, say 45 to 5,000. Now granted, it might give up some above 7, but it feels like they get off the corners faster and they love it more. Does it make more power on the dyno? Not necessarily, but it's definitely quicker off the turn. So it's faster, and you want to win. You want to make more peak power on the dyno, or do you want to win? So there's no direct answer. It's so dependent. So hopefully that gives some understanding there. And the last thing I'm going to end with, because we don't talk about enough, and I don't because it's don't be stupid is exhaust. There's some stupid stuff. For instance, I don't know why it popped up, but I heard someone popped up on my YouTube when I was trying to watch stuff about, I don't know, worst YouTubers in the world or something. But one of the things that popped up on my video feed, besides this horrible person on YouTube, which I didn't know there were so many people that actually take advantage on YouTube, but I guess there are a bunch. And they have millions of views too. Sucks. But anyway, in all that, someone popped up a video of someone doing a Pro Max LS3 and they put an exhaust pipe on. And it was like, we flow with an exhaust pipe because when the engine's running on the engine's running in the car, it's got an exhaust pipe on it. I don't flow with an exhaust pipe. And I did a video explaining that, but God, it's been in probably a year and a half. So let me explain why. Don't be stupid. We don't use an exhaust pipe on the flow bench to do it. Let me show you real quick. This is a 2 1/8 inch pipe, right? This is a big sucker. Actually, this is 2 1/4, sorry. This is 1 7/8 inches. If I flow it on there, so in other words, I flow it without an exhaust pipe, it might flow, we're gonna just do it for example, 230. I put the pipe on like this, just angle it over there. Guess what it flows? 250. All right, what about this way? Bad news bears, you're now down to 240, so it's shooting that way. 240, lost flow. So is it the exhaust pipe or the angle that made a difference? What if I do it this way? Then I don't make anything. What if I take this 2 1/4, this gigantic pipe, and I put on there, 270. So if you looked at the numbers off the flow bench, you were like, wow. Oh, sorry, this is a 2 1/8 inch pipe. You would think, man, I should run a 2 1/8 or a 2 1/4 inch exhaust pipe. And you'd be absolutely wrong. That's why we don't use exhaust pipes on the flow bench. That PIP Max program I showed you, that one will actually tell you what header tube diameter you should use. Not only that, the length of the header pipe should be too. Because getting that tune length right makes more of a difference than how much it flows on a flow bench by far on the exhaust side. So hopefully that gives you some information. I have no idea how long this video is because I'm going to have to cut all this together. But guys, you wanted it, you got it. And I probably sound like a moron in some of it. So for some of you, yes, you're right. And for the people that said, no, this is really great and thanks for everything, you're also right. So everybody's right today. But anyway, guys, thanks for watching. Remember, I'm no Superman. I do not port cast iron heads. But I do appreciate every one of you that watch this channel.